So over the last couple of weeks, I've had a chance to play and finish Eternal Strands, a brand new adventure game from Yellow Brick Games. And after 20 hours with the game, I'm ready to answer some key questions you might have about the game. What is Eternal Strands? Is Eternal Strands any good? And more importantly, is Eternal Strands worth playing? I want to also thank the team over at Yellow Brick Games for sending me an early copy to be able to make this review. It's much appreciated. But for now, let's jump into Eternal Strands and find out what it's all about. At its core, Eternal Strands is a mixture of a couple of different genres. If you take the hunting and tracking down of monsters in Monster Hunter and combine it with the size and scale of Shadow of the Colossus, then that is what you get here. The loop in the game is as follows. You go into a designated area that can be explored until you find that creature in an area, engage in a fight and do damage to certain exposed sections until you have depleted their health. Get the rare resource and head back to camp. Use those resources to upgrade your gear and rinse, repeat. Alongside obviously the main story quests, you will be able to explore these areas at your own will, and they aren't really tied to the boss creatures themselves, so you could go through multiple expeditions killing multiple different bosses and not have to worry about going back to camp straight away. You could go to other areas and go and kill other bosses as well. You can also farm resources in these areas from some of these smaller creatures on the map, loot scattered around, and then find them so you can upgrade and progress forward. Where Eternal Strands offers a challenge is figuring out how to harvest each of the bosses themselves. They all have a preset number of properties that you need to meet in order for a harvest point to show on their body. And harvesting is important because it will allow you to get upgrades for various powers that you'll use in the game. The harvesting points are an interesting puzzle that you have to solve for each of the bosses. For example, removing all of the armor on the Ark of the Stricken Earth by destroying the latches on their chest will give you a harvest point that you're able to access. Each of the bosses have this mechanic, and it will serve as the overall challenge as you run into them throughout the game. This part of the game is its best feature. It is the most enjoyable. I wish there was more bosses that we could go up against and more challenges that we could figure out. Unfortunately, it is let down by the game's climbing system. Climbing and traversing environments in these designated areas that you go and visit is actually really good. You can climb up a building and go to where you want to go with ease as long as you have the stamina to do so, and there is no friction there. It's actually a great thing to do to be able to get a vantage point on some of the bosses. The issue lies when interacting with the bosses in combat. It can cause camera issues when hanging onto specific parts like wings or arms. Whilst it's great to climb around on the bosses, it can be hard to see where you are on a boss at times because of this disorientation when they're moving around all the time. And then also I found myself wrestling with certain bosses more than others, which can be a little bit frustrating, especially the flying ones. It's especially amplified in the final boss fight, which I won't show here, and caused me to be frustrated for most of the fight and really put a damper on the final act of the game. The physics engine, though, in Eternal Strands is designed to combine powers that you have in the game in order to make big damage. The focus is for you to use elemental powers such as ice, fire, and kinetic-based powers. You can do things like combine a kinetic blast, an ice wall, shatter the ice, freeze an enemy in place, and then light them on fire. The selection on offer is good, and it's on you to come up with combinations, like being dropped into a sandbox and having the creativity to make it work. My favorite was the kinetic grasp, which allowed you to pick things up and throw them around. You could do this at enemies, and I also particularly enjoyed the minion power to have an extra buddy during combat. I just wish I could have spawned more than just one. This is where another issue lies with the game. Some of the powers are really underwhelming even after leveling them up to level 3, which requires you to harvest more of the bosses. They don't really do too much different. Nothing really changes visually. Maybe the bubble gets a little bit bigger. You may do a tiny bit more damage, but there isn't anything that really makes me say, wow, this was worth leveling up, which is a real shame. This extends to the general combat of the game as well. Whilst there's a pretty standard adventure combat system, block, parry, heavy and light swings, it's let down by the enemy design and challenge. As you reach the later portions of the game, the enemies become more of an annoyance rather than being an obstacle that I had to overcome. They were just in the space causing me grief when I was trying to deal stuff with the boss or just trying to go from point A to point B because I wasn't having fun with the general combat in the game. Oftentimes, I would just pick them up with the kinetic grab and throw them off the nearest ledge. And the frustrating part is that you need to farm these enemies at times to get rare resources and temper them to get upgrades. When it all comes together, the gameplay starts to lose its fun factor after you've gone through a couple of the bosses a few times, farm through some of the enemies to get the upgrades you need. After that, it becomes a little bit of a chore, which isn't really that fun. There is a slight piece of hope though with the gearing system, which actually has some benefits in the game. Throughout the game, you will find schematics for gear and get resources from the bosses and enemies, as I've said, but you'll be able to use them to make armor. The cool thing is they are allowing you to use certain resources to increase different attributes, such as cold resistance or fire resistance on a piece of gear or a weapon. It can also be reforged at any time with those better materials, so you don't have to make a brand new piece of gear, and they can also be upgraded in the forge as well. Certain pieces of gear will give you a bonus to a stat like stamina or max magic, but this is where we run into another issue that the game has. It has a stat screen, but it doesn't really give you the full picture of everything you need. So generally, I just took max magic as this small boost, and it would just be nice to know these values. Unless I misread them when I was playing, I didn't really see a stat that showed this is how much benefit I am getting, or if I wore multiple pieces, how much that would improve. Eventually got a sword all the way up to level 5, but it didn't really feel any better. Sure, having some additional moves like an ice strike with a sword or an additional attack that you can use with the two-hander, but there wasn't really any urgency for me to go out and get the gear because of how combat and the boss fights play out. If I had to make a suggestion to improve on this, if there was more enemies that had cold, fire and kinetic powers and they kind of played off one another and you needed to have a kinetic bow to be able to do damage to them, and it kind of forced you to go and find it in the world and explore, and I think that might have been a little bit better. But ultimately, it just falls flat and it doesn't really get bolstered by the combat at all. The issues I have with the game extend outwards from just gameplay and combat. It goes into mission design as well. I would say that 90% of the missions that you do in the game are all fetch quests. Go here and collect a piece of dialogue or an item, return back to base, collect a resource for a camp upgrade, with the only difference being kill this boss at a certain time of day. And this is where you run into a lot of problems, especially when you get to the 10 to 15 hour mark. It really starts to drag and become boring to play through, and that's just the main quest and extends to the side content as well. What baffles me is that the environments you're exploring are really great. There's these lush forests, an abandoned city, military garrison, an underground forge. These environments that you go and visit can also change based on the weather conditions, and so do the enemies as well. There could be a corrupt miasma that affects enemies and gives you some different loot. Drought that enhances fire effects, and you can use it against ice bosses. There could have been something really great to throw in here when it came to farming gear and bosses, but sadly, it's still fetch quests, which means a majority of the time you are just walking around an empty environment. And whilst that's great to look at, it's not overly enjoyable to play. Add in the frustration of these smaller enemies, and that experience doesn't really get that much better. And I think the thing that encapsulates a lot of this, which goes in hand with the mission design, is how I feel about Eternal Strands' story. The story of Eternal Strands centers around Bryn and her band of Weavers. Weavers are magic users that have expanded out into the world, but originate from the Enclave, a great city of magic that had an unfortunate calamity and meant much of the magic in the world led to power struggles, and Weavers were blamed and frowned upon, and this city is kind of isolated and away from the rest of the world. Bryn and the crew find their way into the Enclave, and it's obviously ruined, and you have to figure out what all of the secrets are inside. Really cool concept, and I like what's going on here. That is as much of a description that I need to give you, because there's a lot of lore and world building and great stuff to like in here. Each of the characters has great voice acting. I really like the art design of all the different characters and how they present personality in their dialogue. The problem is how the story is told and how it becomes very unengaging to be a part of. Pretty much all of the dialogue in the game is told through a visual novel style conversation. Now, whilst this can work, the problem is not with the content of the story, it's with that visual novel style presentation, because each of the characters in the game has like 3 or 4 preset pictures they have during dialogue. Default, smiling, serious, and maybe one with their eyes closed. It doesn't articulate the characters' voices and it doesn't enhance the voice acting. It slows it down and can really bring the pace to a crawl. And I found it hard to engage after a few hours. And then honestly, towards the latter half of the game, I was just skipping lines of dialogue to only get to the important talking points because I just wasn't that interested anymore. Now that sounds like I'm ruining the experience for myself, but let me give you an example. And it was made painfully apparent as one of the key moments in the game was supposed to be this emotional, impactful moment. The voice actor was killing it with the delivery and the impact, but the character's PNG on screen didn't change at all to showcase this. It was just a stern looking picture. It just sucked out all of the immersion and all of the impact of the event. It becomes more apparent when they switch to this stylized animation cutscene like seen on screen right now, which is like right at the beginning of the game. And these were awesome because they showed the characters' key traits and personalities, emotions, and every time I saw one, I was like, yes, this is what I want to see. But sadly, they are few and far between. And I want to note that it's not the content that was the problem or the messages that they were trying to portray here. There was conversation about trusts, lies, anxiety, ancient civilizations, and discovery, but it was hampered by how it was presented, and it just didn't click with me. I wanted to engage in the side characters' content. I wanted to learn all about these characters' stories and what they were doing, but I just couldn't get to grips with this presentation because there would be this really awesome moment and then we would just go back to pressing A or letting the dialogue play out, and it just kind of snapped me back and snapped me out of the game. That leaves us with a couple of questions to answer. Is Eternal Strands any good, and is it worth playing? Sadly, no. Eternal Strands has some really bright sparks, and it could have been so much more than what it ultimately turned out to be. It's an interesting concept that unfortunately didn't have the legs. Let down by poor story presentation and mission design, and I went into this wanting to enjoy it, but I really struggled to finish my 20-hour or so playthrough. I can't recommend Eternal Strands to anyone right now. There are a lot of ideas here that weren't fully realized, and I want to like this game so much more, but it just didn't land with me. I do think it's important to note that this is the development team's first game that they put out as a new studio. I don't think that strays from the issues that they have with the game. I think there's a lot of potential that this studio has and things that they could do in a future entry if they were to refine things or make something completely different, and I'll be interested to see what they develop next. And I do want to thank the studio for giving me access to the game to be able to make this review, as it's much appreciated, but unfortunately the game didn't click with me, so hopefully the next one will do. But let me know down in the comment section, what do you think of Eternal Strands? Are you going to be checking it out? Let me know. And as always, if these videos have been informative and helpful, leave a like on it, subscribe as always, and this has been It's Jimbo, and I'll see you guys next time.